So I'm going to just start with a bio and then we'll get started. So Professor Emeritus Rob O'Donoghue was born in Ireland, moved to Africa at a young age, and completed schooling in Harare, Zimbabwe. He and his wife qualified as teachers through Bulawayo Teachers College and the University of Zimbabwe, teaching in primary schools in Gweru and at St. Charles College in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa. This was followed by a post as the Environmental Education Coordinator at KZN Wildlife, a job that he enjoyed for 19 years. His years in nature conservation allowed him to complete a master's in education on participatory curriculum development in the sciences in 1990 through the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and a PhD at Rhodes University on the emergence of environmental education in Eastern Southern Africa in 1997. He became involved with Rhodes University through the Environmental Education Association of Southern Africa, and his early work on active learning expanded into citizen science, open access publishing initiatives, and the development of materials for environmental education fieldwork. Further programs include Green Schools with Kevin Burge, the Social Environmental Policy Pack with Kim Ward, the School Environmental Policy Pack with Kim Ward, the Eco Schools Project with Dr. Jim Taylor of WESA, and the Environmental Learning Research Center at Rhodes University's Education Department with Professor Hela Tsitsitka, where he served as director for close to 15 years. We have a lot of different information to share here, so if you just bear with me, I'd like to share just this last part of the paragraph and provide some nice insights as to how this topic came together. Additional work that he's been working on is on outcomes-based education and the current curriculum and assessment policy statement. These have provided key orientating perspectives for environmental and sustainability education in Southern Africa today, and are informing teacher professional development through the Fundisa for Change initiative. His close attention to environmental education and ESD led to a 2014 workshop at the UNESCO World Congress on ESD in Nagoya, Japan, to conclude the UN Decade on ESD and map out the current global action program for ESD, extensive field guides and resource packs available through WESA and ShareNet, and an evaluation toolkit with Makana RCE and United Nations University's Institute for Advanced Study of Sustainability. So you can check a lot of his resources out at both of those sites. And his current work on Indigenous knowledge in education has been expanded by past students in developing international exchanges from Australia and Japan to India and Mexico. And much of this work has now extended into a review of critical theory in education and co-engaged environmental learning in post-colonial curriculum and community contexts. The emerging work that he's been doing with Handprints for Change in ESD is centered on learning to look after others, to best care for ourselves and our surroundings. So that, it sounds like a wonderful way to get us going and learn from Rob. So I'll hand it over to you now, Rob. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kim. I'd forgotten so much of that. My goodness. I've been around for some time, and South Africa and Southern Africa is such an exciting area to be in for ESD, and the work that my students have been doing for the last decade on Indigenous knowledge. So I'm Rob O'Donoghue from the Environmental Learning Research Center in Rhodes University, and what I'm going to try to do today is to open up some perspectives on Indigenous knowledge and active learning. Now my machine won't work. Oh, there we go. Can you see it well, everything? I've been working with Fundisa for Change. That's good, yeah. The Fundisa for Change is a teacher education program. And Handprints for Change has now gone international, and there's a global committee for cooperation on Handprint for Change, and I draw on some of that work in the active learning. LOCUMS is a project in Norway, a research project on local culture for understanding maths and science. And I'm on ExpertNet, which is a cooperative run by Engagement Global across Mexico, India, South Africa, and Germany. So what I'm trying to do is to open up our latest research, which is to look at ESD and education in the 21st century as being more inclusive, cultural, historically orientated, around deliberation for collective transitioning to future sustainability. So coming out of environmental education and ESD, education for the 21st century is about that more than anything else. So I've prepared this presentation so that it kind of speaks for itself and it unfolds. And I've referenced everything as fully as I can so that anyone who listens can have the presentation and can source much of the information that's there, all of it, hopefully. What I'd like to do is to open up with a sense of the limitations in current systems of reason in education. I borrow this from Tom Popkowitz. He talks about the systems of reason and the way that we're within these systems of reason, and we often don't know where our feet are standing. And there are two limitations that I'd like to put up front to start with, and that's the instrumental legacy of exclusion in colonial modernity, which is very strongly felt in the South, because those were the colonized areas that had inflicted upon them the types of education to change people, and that instrumental legacy is still with us today. Within this, there's a common counter-hegemony, a common opposing of indigenous and Western knowledge systems. And I'd like to open up that and some of the limitations of the naive assumptions within that dialectical approach. So the presentation is centered on the notion of plural cultural collectives changing unsustainable material practices through education. And what I'll do is I'll start with some of the literature, informing the culturally situated collective learning, reflexive transitioning approaches to future sustainability through ESD. And I've referenced the slides on the side, as you will see that. Then I look at a simple schema for local culture in deliberative action learning, some framing tools for predictive active learning, drawing on the recent work in the cognitive sciences. I look at some examples of ethics-led learning in indigenous cultures, and then look at developing an ESD-CARE curriculum in the life skills in South Africa, grades 4 to 6. And I put in a little example of Ellie, the feral cat, as an example of the materials that we're developing, and then conclude with a planning tool for handprint action learning. So I've got quite a full agenda. I'm going to run through it, and hopefully you'll be able to note down questions and we'll have a good chat at the end. So moving beyond the narrow dialectical and instrumental systems of reason in education is quite a challenge, because the ideas just roll off our tongues. But reliable empirical measures of behavior are elusive, and decades of education research have not yet established a causal progression across education awareness and behavior. So I'd like to bring the notion of education awareness and behavior into serious question, along with a similar opposing of indigenous and Western knowledge systems. And this cannot be sustained under close scrutiny, despite its popularity. Alongside these instrumental and dialectical systems of reason in education, there's been a swing to more inclusive, plural, and participatory perspectives that we're a lot more comfortable with. And they involve learning, reflexivity, and change. Despite this switch, we still tend to use the old language. So what I'm going to try to do is to look at co-engaged deliberative work within local intergenerational cultures as now coming to the fore, particularly as a response to the limitations of the systems of reason that have been dominant in the last 30 years. And we're now looking at inclusive processes of expanding care in a changing world in the work that we're doing. And the little catchphrase, learning to look after others to best care for ourselves and our surroundings, has taken on a popular tone and is a very useful starting point for people to join the conversations that we're involved with. So let's look at some of the theory informing ESD as inclusive deliberation. I'd like to, first of all, look at Engestrom's work, where he contemplates activity theory as expansive transitions. And here he has the idea of change laboratories, and Ira mentioned earlier the idea of living labs. And these ideas have really come to the fore as participatory forums for transitioning in ESD. What he says is dialectics, as it was conceived by Hegel and by many of Hegel's materialist followers, the Marxist and critical theorists, is here problematic in two respects. Firstly, dialectics as a method of thought is commonly pictured as a solitary endeavor by the individual. And secondly, dialectics is commonly pictured as a method of thought only. And to Engstrom, these have serious limitations. And in his analysis, dialectics is the logic of expansion. And expansion is essentially a social and a practical process having to do with, and here's the nudge, collectives of people reconstructing their material practice. And this is the heart of the matter. People working together in indigenous knowledge settings as starting points for reconstructing their material practice. And I'm sure you're all very comfortable with this particular perspective and familiar with these types of approaches. But what we often lose sight of is that humans make sense of things with what they know. And I draw on Norbert Elias's work in sociology here, in process sociology. He says the methods which people use in acquiring knowledge is functionally interdependent with, and thus inseparable from, the substance of the knowledge they possess, and especially from their basic image of the world. If this image is different, the method they devise for acquiring knowledge is, as a matter of course, different too. This is really critically important. So not only do we have collectives of people, but as collectives of people, we work from what is known to them, what is known to us, all right, to reconstruct our material practice. Now, you can see what I'm up to. What I'm doing is I'm trying to build up a process model for a post-awareness values style of instrumental education. So the next person I'd like to draw on is the depth inquiry and emancipatory well-being work, where what Roy Bascar argues is that human well-being is not easy to measure or to stipulate a priori. And what he says in contemplating explanatory critique and emancipatory practice as in-depth inquiry, he concludes, what constitutes well-being and rationality cannot, of course, be stipulated in advance of depth inquiry. And here's the rub. It is discovered during its course. So a lot of the learning for future sustainability cannot be a priori set up so that we deliver it to other people. People have to discover it through the course of working together in their situations. So now we've got the picture expanding, co-engaged collectives of people working from what is known to them, constitute well-being and rationality for the well-being of future sustainability during the course of depth inquiry to reconstruct their material practices. So what we're doing now is we're building a theory of situated depth inquiry for sustainable well-being. And now I move to the south. And the idea of situated intergenerational learning starts to bring indigenous knowledge into the perspective, where ontology, ethical solidarity, and shared knowledge has come out of the southern approaches to critical theory. And here they're quite strongly emancipatory. And if you look at critical theory when it was exported to the north, again from the south, what it became was empowerment. So emancipation became empowerment. And what one had then was the muting of the idea of freedom. And this work is being done by Sandoval Rivera, Juan Carlos, And he examines these onto-ethico-epistemic dimensions in emancipatory socio-historical process of learning in Mexico around indigenous knowledge and bien vivir, an intergenerational good life that is both desirable and fulfilling. So for the first time now, we start seeing that the indigenous knowledge side, drawing on intergenerational culture and life experience, sustainable well-being is discovered during the course of depth inquiry as co-engaged collectors of people collaborate on emancipatory concerns, working from what is known to them. Now, this adds a new dimension from the South for our planning of the learning that we're going to be involved with in ESD to reconstruct material practices. Now, deliberating change, now switching back to sociology and Margaret Archer's works, suggests that learning and change in relation to culturally situated concerns develops within inner conversations. This is very similar to the Vygotskian work on inner speech that one finds in the social learning approaches to, or social learning theory. As we mediate our experiences, concerns, developing agency and identity. It's a very sophisticated piece of work that she does. And she notes how the inner conversation is a matter of referential reflexivity. So we start getting now good, strong sociological theories of change in which we ponder upon the world and about our place in it and what our place in it should be. Social realities enters objectively into our making, but one of the greatest of human powers is that we can subjectively conceive of remaking society and ourselves. So here's the big jump into theories that support education as a reflexive process of change. To accomplish this entails objective work in the world, by the self, and with others. And you can see this very, very much supports our approaches to situated participatory work in ESD. So let's try to put the whole picture together. And just for fun, what I did is I looked at this co-engaged struggle for sustainable well-being, and I said, well, what have we come up, what's come out so far? Drawing on intergenerational culture and life experience, sustainable well-being is open to discovery. Very good idea. During the course of depth inquiry, by collectives of people, working from what is known to them, around shared emancipatory concerns, emergent in internal conversation, and deliberative meaning-making, for subjectively conceiving a remaking of society and ourselves through objective work in the world to reconstruct our material practice together. Now that's quite a mouthful, isn't it? So it's probably quite important to distill this down. So indigenous knowledge, the intergenerational cultures of knowing kind of comes out in the first part. Next, in collective emancipatory inquiry, working from what is known, and in deliberative action learning on emerging pathways to sustainability. So whichever literature you're working with, it's interesting that they throw up very similar things. But often what's neglected is the intergenerational cultures of knowing as being so foundational to the work that we're trying to do. Now, this is quite a complex set of words. So what I want to try to do is to offer you a very simple schema for local culture in deliberative action learning. And this I originally saw as a slide with one person. So I got a friendly artist, or a friend of mine, to just draw a group of people standing on the traditions of understanding that come out of their cultural and biological history. And here I want to take you to Malaysia, where sejahtera is an indigenous idea which can be worked with alongside the scientific disciplines as a real presence in the past, that both the sciences and indigenous knowledge stand as traditions of understanding for us to bring about change in the world. And we can do this by tuning in, because knowledge comes to us from others and we make it our own. As we make it our own, we have a world that we can touch, and we can touch each other. We have the capacity to talk and communicate. We can think, and we can take action together. So this simple schematic shows us that deliberative learning pathways is what ESD is about, reframing material practices. And so deliberative action learning, as we're conceiving and working with it in our CARE programs that I'm going to share with you, is a collective meaning making to reconstruct material practices. And this notion of material practices has become really important to us, because often what we do is we present environmental concerns as problems and as issues. And we very seldom get down to the material practices that have produced the injustices, the exclusions, and the marginalizations in society that need emancipatory work for us to free ourselves from the problems that the 20th century has produced for humanity and for our planet. So what is needing a bit of clarification is the cognitive processes of predictive active action learning that have been coming out of recent work in the cognitive sciences. And here, what I'm doing is I'm talking about the predictive functioning of our cognitive processes, drawing on Feldman Barrett, who suggests that your brain issues a storm of predictions, stimulates their consequences as if they were present, and checks and corrects these predictions against actual sensory input. So what she does is she produces this very interesting prediction loop, which is fascinating because it says all human beings are predictive simulators, and then we can compare and resolve. So we are active learners is coming out of the discourse of the cognitive sciences at the moment. Once our predictions are correct enough, they not only create and reflexively inform us and our perceptions and actions, but also explain the meaning of your sensations. This is your brain's default mode, and marvelously, your brain does not just predict the future, it can imagine the future at will. In every waking moment, our brain uses past experiences organized in concepts to guide your actions and to give your sensations meaning. So this was very useful insight. Suddenly, we are dealing with human beings with a capacity to work, to predict, and to develop agency to bring about change. So predictive learning cycles of simulation and reflexive change enable us to develop competences. And it's interesting, competences to recognize with knowledge, to assess in relation to value, and to act and do things on matters of concern. So it's quite interesting then when you go to the competences that Ira said that you're going to be talking about later, with Wieck et al. And the work that's been done in Germany and elsewhere in the world. Competences has recently been defined in 2016 as referring to the knowledge, dispositions, and capacity to act together in ways that enable participants to recognize concerns, assess value, and act on emerging matters of concern. And here, let's get more practical and into pictures. Here's a picture of some youth in a river, and immediately we could ask, well, there are participants in ESD using past experiences and concepts to recognize something. So if you look carefully at that, they are predicting, simulating, comparing, and resolving, because they're doing a mini SAS river assessment, like the Global Rivers work or the Stream Watch. And they come from the settlement behind, and it was an apartheid settlement where the infrastructure was poorly put in, and the sewage flows into this river, and it was highly polluted. So they became concerned about this, and they assessed that it was very important to start an education program to do something about it. And their action was to start communicating to people about the blocked sewers running into the river and polluting the water source for millions of people in the Pietermaritzburg and Durban area in eastern southern Africa. And it's amazing the dynamic of youth actively engaged in the world, communicating with other people, and being able to do something about these kinds of concerns. And obviously, drawing on history and culture and indigenous knowledge in the area. For example, one of the issues of indigenous knowledge, people knew that the sewage washed into the water every time it rained when the first rains came at the breaking of the drought, the beginning of the rainy season. People knew not to drink the water from the rivers. They knew to collect water in puddles. And this worked very effectively. So the students are able to apply this knowledge to the situation that they're confronted in the science today. So what I'd like to do now is to switch tacks a little bit and try to emphasize a little bit more the importance of local culture in deliberative action learning. And here I'm going to draw on the LOCUMS project, Local Culture for Understanding Maths and Science, which is amongst the Sami people up in the cold north of Norway. And this is a wonderful image in the culture of the Sami people for wind. And the poetry about this poem that I came across is about the wind blowing through your heart and the idea of care and community and solidarity being really important, but uncertainties and dealing with the uncertainties. But I'll let the poem speak for itself. I feel like being an instrument played by the life. If life still remembers me and suddenly wants to play me, I would want to be that instrument and play as long as life wants, in the future as well. A wonderful, evocative, cultural orientation to future sustainability. So when we assess the LOCUMS work, and we were looking at it for framing ethics-led learning actions, concern for others was central to the Indigenous perspective. Being attentive to each other's needs, being respectful for all, to all, and being engaged, what is best for the common good. And if you take the simple idea of recognizing concerns through concern and attentiveness, assessing value and being respectful and acting, then what one's got is empathy and agency. And you've got a very simple model for situated learning, where expanding through care, through collective learning, to recognize concerns, assess value and act, to best care for ourselves through looking after others and our surroundings. And not only have I found this in Africa and in the LOCUMS work, but it's pervasive across so many cultures. This idea of depth inquiry as caring thinking. And when I was in Malaysia, they were borrowing from Lipman's work in North America on the idea of caring thinking. And what they were doing is they were saying, well, in any context of intergenerational cultural history and life experience, you've got all of these factors, these regulative ideas happening. But in that situation, you've got Sujatra that I mentioned earlier in that little schema. And here you've got people through Sujatra who are able to recognize things in different ways. They're able to assess value and they're able to act based on the Sujatra that informs them. That's that intergenerational cultural history. They're able to take action together, and the concerns, attentiveness, respect, and engaged action learning takes on a particular character that is relevant in that setting. And caring thinking develops in a particular way so that empathy and agency start to influence material practices. So I hope that by showing you these images, what I'm able to do is exemplify the indigenous knowledge, the cultural artifacts and perspectives and capital that people bring into perspective. So then for our ESD-CARE work, what we started to do is looking at local culture and deliberative action learning to change these material practices. So if you take local culture, what you've got is local culture and the SDGs. Then you've got the simple little CARE acronym: concern, attentiveness, respect, and engaged in learning actions. But the deliberative depth inquiry and the SDGs allow us to look in depth at a whole lot of concerns that are of concern to local cultures if we're going to learn to look after others, to best care for ourselves and our surroundings. This will start by humans developing the agency and raising the concerns that come out of local culture applied in deliberative learning. And here in South Africa, we get Hunu Ubuntu. I'm sure many of you heard of Ubuntu, but Hunu Ubuntu, it was originally amongst the Shona, and it's said to be the origins of the broader philosophy of Ubuntu that is now even taken up in the Ubuntu Commission of the United Nations. But the deliberative depth learning concerns are recognized because of the identity that people have with others that enable them to assess value in particular ways and to act in particular ways for more sustainable material practices within expanding care. So this was the perspective that we started to work with in the life skills curriculum. So now we'll go on to the curriculum work using a handprints approach, where if we take the SDGs at a starting point, the curriculum says self, others, and surroundings are important. And self is the development of self, social responsibility for others, and our surroundings, health and environmental responsibility. So this was the starting point in the curriculum. It already exists. And what we were able to do was we were able to say, well, how are we going to start? Children today work much more with visual imagery, photos and videos. And we had videos and photos that people could use to start up conversations and to develop their own learning progressions that are mediated with starting points by the educator. So recognizing what is known and using what you know to look at a photograph, an issue suddenly converts into a concern. And too many abstract issues occur that the students don't really recognize and deeply think about, so that they care about them, that they are concerned for others. And then they're able to assess value through this developing concern and become attentive to needs, and then start to act so that by sharing authentic stories, the stories that the videos and pictures provoke, then what we've got is respect for others and engagement in action learning starting up. So we start getting this development of empathy and agency. And you start getting the situated learning actions beginning to emerge as deliberate work starts to relate to action learning activities to explore material practices. So that's the logic that this work started to develop towards. And here's some of the material that we are starting to produce for the SPCA-CARE. SPCA is the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So we had a strong animal focus. And the next slide will show you the topics. It's divided into 2 terms, which consists of startup photographs and video material, stories and newspaper articles, and they get an assignment to do some problem solving. And then we get a case study where they start doing audits into local areas. And then we have design and make activities using handprints to actually produce new materials. And we get this curriculum beginning to develop with materials 1 to 4 above, and with assessment tasks 2 to 4 above. And then what the students get is a personal change project at the end of 2 terms of work, where they work with it through the holidays and into a 3rd term. So here are some of the topics. For the problem-solving assignment, we've picked out health and nutrition, caring for animals, cultural heritage, guiding our ideas. These are existing topics that are in the curriculum. And the study, feral cats, angry dogs. Often children are attacked by angry dogs on the way to school, or the angry dogs growl and bark at the fences, and the children terrorize them. So then animals are not well fed often. Some animals are overfed and they suffer the same early onset diabetes and obesity that is prevalent amongst humans. Rats, mice, and moles are often controlled with poisons, which are detrimental to the environment, and so on with butterflies, moths, and bees and toxicity. And we have a monkey business in our towns because the monkeys have moved to town and they do a lot of damage trying to eke out a life. And the design tasks we've got are worm farms, leaf composters, and all the standard stuff that you'd expect. But in the brackets, Izala is the indigenous knowledge. Amanzi Mnandi, indigenous knowledge. Imifino, the green vegetable, indigenous knowledge. And also traditional ways of controlling termites and pests. And then the personal change project, where the students pull everything together. So you can see that the big theory, the learning theory, the indigenous knowledge perspectives are all emerging in the curriculum work that's developing. And if there's time now, what I'll do is I'll share with you the story of Ellie, the one-eyed feral cat, the concern for others, being attentive to needs, respectful to all, and engaged in what is best for the common good. It's about a 4-minute story as an example. Kim, is there time that I could actually share this little story?
Sure.
Okay, thanks, Ira. Right, so Ellie, the one-eyed feral cat, and you can see there's Ellie. When the children first look at Ellie, they wonder, is the eye closed? And then they debate it and think about it. And, oh, she looks like a little bit of a mangy cat. She looks like, is she cross or is she smiling? You can't really tell. And it's fascinating when children begin to recognize their stories in relation to the story. And then they assess value in different ways. Oh, feral cats are bad. I've got a cat at home. That is really nice. So telling them the story of Ellie, the one-eyed feral cat, is a starting point that teachers used. And here it is, and I'll read it out just quietly and quickly. Ellie must have been a cute, adorable kitten. She was probably abused when she grew up, and she must have run away, met a tomcat, become pregnant, and then gave birth to her kitten in our front yard swimming pool cupboard under the braai. A braai is a barbecue. We didn't notice her at first, but early one morning when I went out for a walk, I saw her carrying a large rat into her cupboard house. She was staggering a bit and shaking her head because her eye had been injured in the life and death struggle to kill the large rat that she could now hardly carry. I crept up to peep into the cupboard, and there I saw her opening up the belly of the rat to feed her kitten, a tiny ginger ball of fur who was probably about a week old. The kitten saw me, puffed up and hissed fiercely, and Ellie turned in a flash to defend her baby and the food. Not wanting to frighten and disturb them, I backed off and left them to feast in peace. Later that day, I phoned the SPCA to find out if they could come to do something about the problem of the feral cat that gave birth to a kitten in my garden. We had had feral cats before, and our dog had, with my encouragement, chased them away. This had not stopped the problem, and every few nights we had howling cat fights in our garden, and I had to get up and chase them away. We also had rats in the roof, so Ellie had done us a good thing. And I felt sorry for this tiny mother cat with her, who was struggling to feed her baby. The SPCA told me that I could hire a trap to catch a feral cat whom they would have to put to sleep, because cats born in the wild cannot easily be tamed to become household pets. The alternative was to feed the mother so that both cat and kitten remained strong and healthy, and then to catch them so that they could be immunized, neutered, and then released back into our garden. Having a healthy feral cat in the garden would keep the rats down and stop other feral cats coming in to take the place of the cat that we had removed. We fed the cats for the next few weeks so that they were strong and healthy when we captured them in the SPCA trap. When we sprung the trap, they went wild and clung to the bars, hissing and growling at us in anger. They could not be handled except by the experts at the SPCA, who used thick gloves and knew how to hold an angry feral cat and keep it calm. The first thing we noticed was that Ellie's eye was torn and white, probably from the injury that she received when she killed a rat to feed her kitten. The vet had to remove the infected eye and spay her so that she could not get pregnant and have any more kittens. Pops, her kitten, turned out to be a boy, and he was also neutered so that he could not have any babies with other cats, and also so that he was calmer and wasn't as aggressive as some of the other male cats. When the cats were returned to us, they were calmer, but still could not be handled. So we kept them in the cage and fed them for a few days before we released them back into the garden that they knew as home. We wanted them to be welcome and safe in the front yard and to make friends with our dog who lived in the big backyard. We felt good about what we had successfully done to save Ellie and Pops so that they could feel at home in our large garden and grew healthy and strong so that we could not have any more problems with other feral cats. There were still some cat fights from time to time. They did not last long as Pops and Ellie, now strong and healthy, defended their territory and drove away the intruders. Today, Pops and Ellie are relaxed and feel at home in their garden home. They come for food when we call to feed them each day, and our neighbors put out food when we're away. Ellie loves to be tickled behind the ears, but still hates to be picked up. Pops can also be gently touched by me when he's eating from his bowl. But as soon as he's finished, he moves away purring, but still preferring to keep his distance from all humans. And here's Pops, washing his face with his paws after supper. So that's an example of starting points. And it's really interesting how Indigenous knowledge in relation to cats, life experiences, and dispositions really are brought forward in first the pictures and then in relation to the stories. And the tendency of wanting to care and cuddle for cats begins to take on a new life. How do you look after cats to allow them to look after each other? And what do they look after? And so on and so forth. Many, many questions about learning to look after others, the wild cats, so that we can best look after ourselves and our surroundings. So here's the final slide now. If we're going to be planning this kind of thing, photo deliberations that are coming out of our research raise a lot of local culture and Indigenous knowledge and historical perspectives. And also the young people that are looking at these photographs, they are very sophisticated at reading visual imagery, much more than we were in our day all those years ago. Story sharing and storytelling is such a part of Indigenous knowledge, and it's such a part of life, where when someone tells you a story, you immediately think of a story that you could tell them back, and you're just fascinated by their story and willing to share your own stories. Handprint audit actions and the handprint ideas have come out really strongly in this work that we're doing at the moment. So the little model that we're developing, which we've published through UNESCO in a book that's just been released, is about the changing ESD learning and training environments, and also the cashew work of ESD ExpertNet includes some of the other interesting methodologies as well. But here's the picture for planning 5T action learning. Tuning in with Indigenous knowledge and planning together, the balance of talk, think, and touch, and the idea of action taking to actually have something to talk about, to learn. It's an open sort of process framework, which we're calling Nexus Learning Actions towards safer, more just, and sustainable futures. So that's basically what I came here to share. And what I've done is put in some of the most significant references. You'll be able to relate them to the references that you're working from and be able to explore these ideas. And now I'd welcome comments and questions.
What a beautiful presentation, Rob. Thank you so much. The reference list is extremely helpful. Before going to any of the questions that have coming into the chat box, let me turn to Kim as our host, who can engage you with a few questions of her own.
Super. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ira. Hopefully I do not have feedback or you can't hear the echo effect on my voice. So, Rob, that was very lovely, and I appreciate the emphasis at the end on the nexus of matters of concern. And remember back now, it was actually, you and I met in 2013, I remember now, in Nairobi, and in 2012 in Rio, the emphasis from the children who said, you know, we always talk about our footprints and what we do wrong, but we have hands, right? And what can we do right? And so really being purposeful in active learning to utilize knowledge for the benefit of addressing real issues in our communities, I found that very touching. So that's just a quick comment. I have a question and then two bits of questions, and then I'm going to hand it back to Ira, who will be responding or sharing the questions from the chat box. So in the beginning, you mentioned the power of reflexivity and inner conversations that we can have. And I was just wondering, for your own personal journey, what were your own inner conversations or referential reflexivity that really made you think about your own work and how to contribute to the world?
Well, I was besieged by students who wanted to study Indigenous knowledge. And you just have to have one look at me and you can see that I'm not indigenous to Africa. And what was fascinating to me was to ask them, well, where is this coming from? Why is it so significant? And then what I ended up playing was between their feelings and their motives and drives to understand themselves in a world that has not been very kind to Indigenous people and has marginalized them in the most cruel ways. And then what the literature says. So my internal conversations were about, well, we're doing all of this ESD work, but have we got adequate theories for situated learning? And I came out of experiential learning and ecology teaching and things like that. And then went into the idea of, have we got adequate ways of approaching learning to produce things that we don't yet have? So have we got adequate theories of change? And that brought me into process sociology, historical sociologies, and social theory, and into critical realism, to start looking for, you know, the tools that allow us to think about how do we enable education as processes of co-engaged deliberative change to produce what we don't have. Because you see, I grew up in the times of behaviorism, where we had to have behavioral objectives for every lesson pre-stipulated. And I always had the doubt that, you know, I'm imposing on my learners when I pre-stipulate. I should really be able to work alongside them and let them find their way. And Lawrence Stenhouse, with his idea of with outcomes in mind, rather than with behavioral outcomes pre-stipulated, was one of the inspirations that took me in those directions.
Great, that's great. So that's good to understand our own stories, really, as professors and as co-teachers, really, with our students. And living here in Hawaii this year, I appreciate your point about sharing stories, and, or the way the term is here, talk story. So the example you gave, the Sami people in Finland in the poem, "The Wind is Blowing Through My Heart," been moved by the transition, finding what words really resonate with people. And one of those is well-being versus sustainable development. And well-being really ties in nicely with your issues of care. And so I was wondering, just the wind, my brain was going through some of these ideas and reflecting on how we all resonate with different aspects of learning. And so this emancipatory inquiry, this process of the wind blowing through your own heart, what do you think, just as one example, just one practical example, has been one of the most emancipating, yeah, there's the poem, this element of a emancipation for yourself, or some big aha for a student that has emerged from this level of inquiry?
Yes, really, I wrote a paper recently for a South American journal around the mistake that we made reading the work in Mexico and in South America in terms of empowerment, rather than in terms of emancipation, as Paulo Freire had intended. And wherever I go, what inspires me is the way that people bring out of themselves the most poetic and depth ideas that one can work with in education. So when I was working with this, I scored a lot of points at home because I bought this beautiful silver wind symbol. And then I read the poetry to my wife over the phone, and she said she missed me a lot, you know, which was really interesting. Because when I was working with children, I said to them, well, what would you like to do in life? When I was working with children in very trying circumstances. And they said to me, you know, I'd like to be a nurse, or I'd like to be a social worker, or I'd like to be a doctor. So why do you want to do that? You know, because they didn't really have much chance of becoming doctors in those difficult circumstances. And they said, well, I want to look after my community. I want to look after people when they're sick. And they were also wanting to be looked after better. So the idea of looking after became also inspirational. And it's these foundational propositions that we often, in the careful planning of learning as progressions, we fail to really allow the students to tune in with poetry and with feelings and with their strongest ideas that they're carrying with them, which will offer learning towards future sustainability. These are sort of like tuned out as we present them global climate change or biodiversity loss as problems. And I've stopped using the P word in a lot of my work. We start looking at these things as concerns. You know, what concerns you about the changes that are happening? Not, you know, biodiversity loss is a big problem that we have to be concerned about, or climate change is the challenge of the decade for humanity to survive. The simple things often inspire me most.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate your additional thoughts on your talk. And I'm going to turn it over to Ira because he has several questions from our audience.
Thanks, Kim. I hope there's no feedback on the line. It seems to be better now. There were some interesting questions that came in for you, Rob. I would say that another set of questions has already been answered by your helpful posting of the reference list. I know that I had some questions there myself for following up on some of the publications that you mentioned during your presentation, and your reference list really does a nice job of pointing us in the right direction. One of our attendees, Matt, is asking, how are you using the word objective, as in objective work in the world? It appears to come out of participatory processes, but objective is something which meets some neutral, at least quasi-science standard. It appears to borrow from the positive connotation of objective. Can you respond to that?
Yes, objective is used in a variety of ways by the authors that I've referred to, and particularly in critical realism, you know, that we do live in a real world of objects. And instead of objective, what I often use is the term reality congruent or object congruence, drawing from the sociology of Norbert. And of course, the learning theory that I'm referring to in the Vygotskian tradition, which I include with Bakhtin as well, in his critical literary tradition, that work goes back quite strongly to, you know, a real world context over time. So life experience comes in to objectivity. And what the Vygotskian tradition did is it left behaviorism behind and started to work much more in a cognitive linguistic framework in Lurier's and Leontev's work. And it was in the Leontev kind of stream that Engerstrom drew from. So what I do is try to work in a post-behaviorist way and try to keep on looking for much more agency-orientated work in the world as being objective work, and particularly drawing on critical realism to resolve the problem of relativism. I hope that's not too much of an intellectual answer, and that it covers many of the dimensions that might be important to the questioner.
Excellent, Rob. I'll ask Matt if he has a follow-up question to put it in the chat box, but meanwhile, I'll move on to a question from Isabel, who earlier in your presentation asked if you have some particular advice on how to develop empathy.
Yeah. There's a wonderful video that is worth looking at. It's called Look Up, and it's a YouTube. I watched it a couple of times and I've really enjoyed it, because what it does is it shows how there's a new loneliness in the world because of social media. And empathy, to my mind, happens by being there, being with people, sharing with people, and simply doing things together. And I'm really concerned when I see people doing things together and they're all individually looking at their cell phones and chatting. You know, I have fewer friends these days because of the new media, because I'm so busy that I can't get out. And I think that most people in the world are using these media much more intensively than we used to. So the sense of personal contact empathy, you know, Ellie and I had a great empathy between each other. I'm sure she was empathetic to me and I was very empathetic to her, but I was reading my stories in her experiences, and she's a cat. And what an inspiring cat that she was for me, and hopefully that she will be for the children that are learning the story. So empathy happens in contacts that inspire, I think, is how I would try to say that to you, Isabel. It's a happening between and in contact with each other.
Can you, Rob, just repeat the name of the video that you mentioned?
Yeah, it's called Look Up, and it's a YouTube. And I found it from a friend. He said to me, Rob, what are you doing taking your cell phone out? And I said, well, it's ringing. And they said, yeah, but we're having coffee together. And I thought, wasn't that a silly thing to do? And he said, have a look at Look Up. And I did. And I was really inspired to keep my cell phone in my pocket when I was in the company of interesting people.
There were some other questions from Isabel, who I see has turned on her webcam, but for those who are not working with webcam and will be listening to the recording that does not capture the webcam, I'll ask the questions for Isabel. Do you have an assessment of these students before and after, meaning the group that you discussed during your presentation, and what age of the students are you doing this with?
Yeah, about 20 years ago, I stopped doing before and after assessments. And it was probably because I was lazy, you know, and I thought, well, is it more important for me to do these before and after assessments or for the children to do them? And is it really important for the children to do my before and after assessments or their own before and after assessments? So in terms of research methodology and evaluation, which I've been working on, and I'm working on a paper now on participatory evaluations, I've tended to move away from the biological model for education research. And I'm trying to use much more co-engaged, sophisticated styles of assessment in my teaching situations.
Thanks, Rob. One other comment that was posted to all by Matt that I was intrigued by, and I wanted to get your reaction to it. Matt observed that the story of Ellie and Pops, which was a lovely story, and I think we all got a lot out of that. Matt says the story shows that there is a place for expert knowledge. He says he wasn't sure. So can you comment on the role of expert knowledge?
Yeah. You know, I was really torn between how do I solve this problem of the little kitten and mother in this cupboard, and the expert knowledge of the vet was really important to me. And it was a shock when he said, well, you catch it and I'll unfortunately have to euthanize it. And Carmen and I then had the same problem repeat itself when we had to leave Grahamstown last year, when I retired to move closer to Carmen's mum up here in Howick in KwaZulu-Natal. And we had to let Ellie and Pops go to the SPCA. And I went to a lot of trouble to go and talk to them again and say to them, but, you know, we've got to capture them. We can't take them with us because we're not allowed cats in this new place that we're at. And I went and met a local farmer who said, oh, he'd take them and they could stay in his barn and he would feed them, and the SPCA would now re-inoculate them again and they'd go out again. So there is definitely a place for expert knowledge. But increasingly, everyone is an expert in their own way. So if you take Indigenous knowledge, it's an expert knowledge coming out of generations of experience. If you take a scientist or a vet or a doctor, it's a different form of expert knowledge. If you're talking to me about if I'm talking to you about my life experiences, I'm an expert on my life experiences. I don't need a psychologist to tell me what to make of my life experiences. But undoubtedly, when my wife says to me, you're mad, then a psychologist might help from time to time, you know. So definitely there's a place for expert knowledge.
Thank you.
Ira, may I step in for a moment? This is Kim.
Yeah,
I just want to recognize that.
I was just going to turn it back over to you to see if you had any follow-up for Rob. Yes.
You're very sweet. I'm so sorry for stepping on your words. I just, when you brought up the point about expertise, there's also the question in the chat box, I think that's from Isabel as well, what does ESD stand for? That's really important and Rob has been very instrumental in creating regional centers of expertise around the world, but it's in recognizing the word that it's expertise, not excellence. We don't all have to be excellent, or we don't all have to have PhDs. A 3-year-old can be an expert in their own life experience. So thinking about what it means for us to integrate knowledge and wisdom from all across a life course, from all different cultures and traditions, is a key part of RCEs. But the ESD is also essential as an acronym, and I'm sorry, Isabel, that we kept using that acronym without stating it, but it's Education for Sustainable Development, and that's the international compromise, really, for a word that maybe doesn't always resonate for everyone. But what's key in there that I really love is the preposition for, and it's the idea of reorienting education towards a sustainable future, and that our work has value, and the experiences of both academics and citizen scientists and learners of all ages. Like, there's a purpose to our being here, and there's a purpose to our work. And I hope that Rob's lessons have really helped us think about new ways of reflecting on our work and how to engage more people with a variety of processes for teaching and learning. So thank you. Rob, do you have a final thought you'd like to share?
Not really. I'd just like to thank Ira and yourself for the opportunity to share these ideas from Africa. Africa is a great place to work. It's full of challenges and great people. And I've really found it inspiring to be challenged to pull together my thoughts. So if anyone's interested, I have got a draft paper that I'm trying to set up on this work. And I don't know what similar papers or similar work that they're doing on either handprints or the concept of ethics-led care work. I'd be really interested in exchanges. I think you've got a great network here and a great idea of opening up ways where, you know, someone can come in and share their bit and others can listen, and you don't have to travel. You know, I'm increasingly finding it challenging to do this travel, not only physically, but I find it problematic to be traveling across the globe. And, you know, when we can work like this, it's intimate. It allows you to pull together your thoughts, to share your thoughts and get feedback from professionals. While I'm in my little African house here, we have very warm rain outside. It's dark now, a real tropical darkness. It's black outside, and it's wonderful to be thinking about Kim just waking up with her coffee in Hawaii and other colleagues across North America and elsewhere being able to listen in, and I'll be able to listen in and be inspired by the work. Hopefully there were some inspiring, interesting and provocative thoughts in what I did share tonight, and I really thank you for the opportunity to put these together. I always learn a lot through these challenges, so thank you very much.
Most definitely, Rob. Very inspiring to us all. This was an extraordinary presentation and a great contribution to the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium community. I appreciate your offer and your interest in exchanging further information and drafts with participants in SCC activities. I also thank you for the kind words about the approach that we've taken in building this network. I think if nothing else, Sustainability Curriculum Consortium has demonstrated that this approach does work. The key is for you and all the attendees on the line, if you enjoyed this experience and like what you heard, we need all the help from individuals to reach out to your own networks to let folks know about our webinars, our faculty conference, our online curriculum dialogue, and other activities. Some listservs welcome our announcements, others not so much, so we really depend on teaching faculty themselves to spread the word among their colleagues. For further information about all of the SCC activities that I mentioned, I won't go into detail as I did at the opening, but please do take a look at the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium's website at www.curriculum4sustainability.org. In particular, we're looking forward to the faculty conference in Pittsburgh, and using this same platform, the GoToMeeting platform, Kim will be leading an International Perspectives panel, and we're going to beam in our presenters through GoToMeeting to the conference itself. So that's to keep in mind in case you cannot join us in Pittsburgh. Again, my thanks to Rob. As always, Kim, great job in pulling everything together. And to all the attendees, thank you so much for tuning in today. Until the next time, signing off. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
All right, thanks.